I realized that when I was talking about the two possible ways of looking at mental health, I was being rather confusing, rather long-winded about it. Unfortunately, it seems that, for me anyway, it's necessary to go about things in a long-winded way before I can see things a little bit more clearly myself. But then it occurred to me that there's a very, very clear way to explain what I mean by these two different ways of understanding mental health. So we have the first way, and the first way is to make the assumption that there is an ideal way for human beings to be, that there is this fixed ideal modality, or that there is a fixed way for each individual person to be, so that I have my ideal blueprint of how I should be. And in that case, mental health very, very clearly means adhering to that blueprint, being the person you're supposed to be, or being the person that you are and cannot change being. So that's very understandable. And if we happen to go down that particular road of thinking there is an ideal way, a particular way, just as there's an ideal way for a car engine to be, we don't want it morphing and changing. When we've got it, we want it to stay the same, because that way the performance is optimal. Any change at all is bad change. And that's true for car engines, unless somehow you can think of an improvement. But as is always said, the ways for things to go wrong is infinitely, not infinitely, but hugely more than the way for things to go right. So the chances that it's going to have an accidental, spontaneous change that's going to improve it is astronomically small. So the health of a car engine is to stay true to its parameters, true to its blueprint. And if we want to believe that that humans are like cars, and in that way, then that's the way we will look at mental health. And the other way of looking at mental health is to say that what's mentally healthy is to grow, to keep on changing, that there is no terminal destination, no Waterloo station or Victoria station to disembark at. And that's another way of looking at what it means to be a human being. We can look at things that way. So that's a growth orientated way. And people often say that you never stop learning, which is true. You never stop growing either. Although we do stop growing. We hit a ceiling for one reason or another. That ceiling might be due to us, might be due to us picking a point and saying, I'm sticking here, thanks, this is it, this is what it means to be me. Or also, it can be society, because society always says, this is what it means to be you. That's what society does all the time. That's what makes society work as a system. That's what makes society be society. The fact that it tells us, this is you, this is what it means to be you. Do you get it? And then eventually we get it. We might not get it straight away, but we do get it, and we conform, and that's fine. So that's fine for society, because society requires that for us. But on the whole, a lot of people would probably go for the growth orientated view of mental health, because it sounds better. It doesn't sound so dreadfully static, and doesn't sound like we're so stuck in a rut, because the other way is being stuck in a rut. It absolutely is being stuck in a rut. The only thing is, we're saying my rut is the right rut. It's the good rut. It's the right. It's the rut that has been ordained by God Almighty, and that's why I'm sticking in it. That's my rut is so great, basically. And that sounds kind of a bit laughable and facetious, but of course that's what we do. All of us are saying my rut is the right rut, and your rut is the wrong rut. It's like Robert Anton Wilson's joke about a violin player and about a very, very bad violin player, in fact. And so what this uniquely bad violin player does, he just keeps hitting the same note over and over and over and over again all day long. So he's practicing all day long, hitting that same note over and over and over again. And his wife is driven demented. Obviously, she's demented, driven completely daft. She's beside herself. And then one day she rushes downstairs from upstairs. Presumably she was there with her hands over her ears, trying to ignore him, trying to block him out. And she said, "Why can't you be like other violin players? They have lots of tunes. You just always hitting the same note." And he says, "Well, you see, those other violin players, they're still looking for the right note. I've found it." And that's Robert Anton Wilson's joke about the violin player, which is just another way of saying what I was trying to say about the rut. It's a slightly funnier way. So what that's saying is that we have to artificially validate the fact that we're not growing and say we've reached the God-ordained destination. And woe betide anyone who questions God, or woe betide anyone who tries to mess with this. And as soon as we say this, it's immediately apparent that this is what human beings do all the time. Hundreds of years, thousands of years, millennia. What else do human beings do apart from this? They create fixed ways of looking at the world and make up loads of excuses why they should never change. They don't say the real reason, which is that they're afraid, or we don't say the real reason, because I suppose I'm part of the human race too. We don't say the real reason, which is I'm afraid. I know where this is. I know what this is. I don't know what comes next, or what the next page is, and I'm frightened to find out. Plus, I've got fond of this page, and I don't want to let it go. It may be crap, but at least it's crap that I'm familiar with. And oddly enough, it can get to this state where we live in a society that's got so far up its own arse, we could say, if we wanted to express matters in that way, that it actually has an official definition of mental health as adhering to this blueprint of what it means to be a human that consumer society has somehow produced. Not for any good reasons, I might add. The blueprint that we've been given to follow isn't there for our own good. It isn't there. It's purely there to help the social system. As I said right at the beginning, it's there because it suits this group identity that we have, not because it suits us as individuals. And the problem with that is that society isn't real. The group identity isn't real. It's just a lot of people pretending that they're not who they are, or that they are who they're not. And then that ghost-like pretense develops, that charade develops a life of its own, and it really does develop a life of its own. It's like a possessing entity in each one of us. The life of the group that nobody is, the life of the consensus that nobody really is. And it has a life of its own, and it jealously guards that life. It holds on to that life. It defends it. So each and every one of us, unless we happen to be remarkably individuated or remarkably enlightened, are possessed by the social persona, by the socially prescribed identity, the socially prescribed way of looking at things. So, of course, that makes all the society's ways of looking at health deeply, deeply suspect. We really can't trust the consensus, the generic mind, at all, because in no way does it have any regard for who we really are. Now, obviously, because I'm going on like this, I am clearly not particularly enamored of the static definition of what mental health is. And I can't be. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's ludicrous. To me, it doesn't make any sense at all. But even having said this, you could say, okay, that makes sense now. That's two ways of looking at mental health. Whether they're right or not, who knows? But it's two ways of looking at what mental health is. But is it really that fundamental? I mean, are they not just two arbitrary particular ways that, have been plucked out of the air? And that's the other point that I really would like to make totally clear, in as much as I'm able to. And the point is that they are only two types of processes in the entire universe. And they only ever could be. And they only ever were, these two. And the two types of processes are processes that are heading towards equilibrium and processes that are moving out of equilibrium. Now, again, this may not sound it may not sound plausible, it may not sound believable, because we're not used to thinking in terms of equilibrium and non-disequilibrium. But I would absolutely go out on a line if I had a line to go out on, or go out on a limb if I had a limb to go out on. That there isn't a single scientist anywhere, physicists I'm talking about, more than physicists or chemists, more than zoologists or entomologists perhaps. But that there isn't a scientist anywhere on the planet who will disagree with this. For the average layman, you might say, oh, there could be lots of other processes, sure, they could be going somewhere else. But what I'm kind of reiterating here, as forcefully as I can, is that there are only two directions to go in: equilibrium and away from equilibrium. And what this really means, if we can go beyond the actual words to what those terms mean, is when we move away from equilibrium, we're moving in the direction of increasing information. When we move the other way, it's decreasing information, i.e. increasing entropy. And the point is that there is nothing else in the universe but information. We might think there's other things. We might think there's doorknobs and cricket bats and owls and ostriches and mobile phones. But that's all information. Everything is information. There are no solid things anywhere. There are no solid entities anywhere. As Bodhidharma said from the very beginning, not a thing was. There's information. That's what it is, information. So obviously there's only two directions to go. Either we're going the direction of ignoring reality and narrowing our tunnel, moving towards an equilibrium, losing information, maximizing entropy, predictability, order, or we're going in the other direction, out into newness. And newness means we don't know what the hell is going to happen next. And not only that, but we don't even have any reference. So we can't even say, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know what kind of thing. That isn't newness. Newness is we don't even know anything at all. We don't have any reference. We don't have any framework. So what we're talking about here is unparalleled uniqueness or unprecedented, lack of precedence, lack of anything that went before it that was like it. That's newness. And because we're so habituated to kind of living in a narrow tunnel that's created by us narrowing things down and gravitating to equilibrium and orbiting equilibria points, living within equilibrium zones, we don't really believe there is such a thing as newness. We might think there's kind of trivial newness, so that if I pull a card out of a pack, I don't know if it's the Queen of Hearts or the Jack of Clubs, but that isn't newness, as I was saying. That's just disguised same old story, because it's the same old story. Whatever card I pull out of a pack of playing cards, it's the same old story. It's just another card. Like if you were ask me to predict what's going to come out, I'd say it's going to be a card. It's going to be a playing card. I'm right. There's no real difference between any playing cards. So we don't tend to have a sense of what absolute uniqueness is. We don't, which is understandable. It's not something we can imagine or visualize or kind of read about in a book and understand. When it happens to us, we still don't understand it. We can't process it. But the one thing we can say is it sure as hell knocks us for six. It knocks us head over heels. Jung called it numinosity, which obviously kind of sounds a bit close to newness. Numinosity, I think he defines somewhere as it's kind of like an experience which is so great and it totally moves us. And I don't just mean that we get moved, as in we could get moved watching an emotional story, say that really moved me, and that's fine. But this is an even bigger moving. This doesn't just move us emotionally, it moves us ontologically, existentially. It absolutely changes our viewpoint on everything. And we have a glimpse of the vastness of what reality is and how very different that is from what we'd like to believe it is. So a numinous experience is, you could say it's like a raw, unprocessed religious experience. Later on we go to process it, we turn it into things that we can understand and we make it into a dogma. Or we could say that it's like what Jung calls one of the big dreams. Not just a dream that's like an echo of what we do during the day, but a dream that absolutely astounds us because there's more in it than there is in our waking experience. So that is also one way in which we can encounter the numinosity. But all of this is just to say that the numinosity is not some little idea. It's the biggest experiential fact that ever could be. All of our normal experiences. For example, if I go to the shop and I buy some tin peas, that's an experience. Whatever I'm doing, it's an experience. But all of these experiences pale away to nothing with any experience that involves the numinosum. There is no, we think normal everyday life as it is filtered through the rational mind is the real thing. Anything else is kind of fanciful or made up stuff or science fiction or psychosis or hippy dippy stuff that isn't real. That's what we think when we're in our rational minds, which is a bizarre position to take because everything that happens when we're in our rational mind is redundant and tedious and completely lacking in numinosity. In other words, it doesn't have the power to move us at all, existentially or ontologically speaking. I'm not sure which is the right word, but whatever it is, rational experience confirms that our way of looking at things is the right way, even if it's a crappy, useless way. It's continually being confirmed by the rational mind as being, yeah, you're looking at things the right way there, buddy. Good for you. Everything we do, and that's what we call the real reality. And after we die, none of that will count for anything because it's just it's not. There was no reality in it. It's pure pointless obsessiveness, pure distraction from reality, really. And yet, whenever reality comes along, or whenever reality does come along, it always changes us, moves us. And that's one definition of information, because we can use information and reality interchangeably. And one definition of information is that which changes us. When we actually get some information filtering through all the filters, through all the blockades, through all the barricades and boundaries, and that we don't even like information because it changes us, because we're afraid of change. But whenever even a little trickle of information reaches us, the person who receives the information is not the same person as the person who was before they received it. We become different. So that's the exciting thing about information. It changes our position, it moves us, it shifts us. And so All there is information, as I said, and we spend our whole lives blocking it out and pretending there's no such thing. And we say that this is the real, this is the real life, this is the real meat of what it means to be existing. And these guys that come and talk about something different, they're off their heads. They're delusory. They're making stuff up because we know what the real stuff is. That's what rationalists always say. They make a virtue of their own closed-mindedness, in other words. And they make a virtue of staying the same, and they make a virtue of saying there's no such thing as anything different that's worth anything. They when we are looking at things that way, making a virtue of being closed-minded, then that for us is what we call mental health. But there's no reality in that, as I keep on saying. If there was reality in it, when we encountered it, it would change us forever. And so the whole of our life as it is, mediated by rationality, isn't worth a damn, really. And yet it's possible to have a dream, and dreams are not supposed to be so, not supposed to be real. To one dream that is far more real than any of this rationally mediated nonsense ever could be, because it never could be anything. So that's that's just to explain the idea of looking at everything as information. And then when we look at everything as information, that does bring thermodynamics into play. Our other ways of looking at stuff don't apply. We have to be able to think in terms of thermodynamics. And there's two sorts of processes, two tropisms. We can be attracted to an equilibrium state, which is like being sucked into a black hole or being held on the surface of a very heavy planet like Saturn or Uranus or whatever. We're very, very limited in our freedom. We might be able to crawl around a bit if we've got the strength, but even that's exhausting on a very big planet. We can't jump very high. And that's a metaphor for saying we can't be very imaginative, or we can't be very creative. We can only jump that high. We're literally very literal minded, very concrete. And that's what equilibria, living in an equilibrium zone, does to us. That's what living in society. You can't jump very high. There's not much leaping. And the other possibility is where somehow we manage to find escape velocity and we leave all that behind. And the thing about an equilibrium zone or an equilibrium sphere of influence, it's not that there is such a thing as an equilibrium. When we get away from it, we realize it was never real anyway. But when we're under its influence is such that it makes us think it's real. And that's like an abusive relationship. When we're in it, we end up believing in it. By pure force, by pure coerciveness, we accept it as normal. When we get away from that coercive, abusive relationship, after a while, we think, what the hell? What was I thinking? What was I doing? And the equilibrium of societies is exactly the same. The equilibrium state of society and all equilibrium states are the same. So really the movement out of an equilibrium state, it's a kind of it's not really a movement out of an equilibrium state, because there never was such a thing as that equilibrium state anyway. But I suppose you could say it's like a movement into reality. That's another way of putting it.